Next.js app router caches a lot by default. If you don't opt out of caching at the right time, you may risk your users seeing stale data, which is not what you want. So in this specific video, we are going to cover the 4 levels of caching inside of Next.js, and we will be covering different practical examples along with really great visuals to walk you through how caching works in depth inside of Next.js, so you will know when to exactly opt out of caching, revalidate your data, or learn about caching in depth. So let's get started. In Next.js, there are 4 different levels of caching. There are different caching mechanisms, and this is a really good table for what they are and where to use them and what's their purpose and so on. And right underneath it, there's also a diagram, which right now you won't really understand because it's really hard to understand what exactly is going on unless you understand the individual pieces first. First, let's take a look at each one of these one by one, along with practical examples, and towards the end, let's reference the specific diagram, and hopefully you will have a really good idea for how this diagram works. So first, we have the request memoization. Instead of referring the documentation, we will be looking at the specific visual that I have created. So for the first one is React request memoization. Now this is something that we both are familiar with. This is nothing new in Next.js, but this is something that we use to memoize requests on the client side. You can memoize requests on the client side if the same request is being made on 2 different pages with the same URL and options. Then it is basically memoized, and let's say you want to pass that data around and share that globally in your application, then you can use props or context or any of that sort to pass information, and that's typically the React way of doing things. This is nothing new in Next.js. But if, let's say, for some reason you cannot use the browser fetch API to make the specific request because you are using a content management system, then in that case you can use the React cache function, which is really cool and really important, and again is only used with React server components, which we'll take a look at a bit later. But this allows you to cache the result of a fetch or computation, and then you can pretty much just cache the specific function, and it basically creates a cached version of that specific function. That's what React request memoization is. And this is just like one level because Next.js does use React under the hood. So a lot of the React concepts, such as the cache function or React server components, apply here as well. Want to invalidate it, then you can easily do that because it only lasts for the lifetime of that specific request. What exactly is a data cache? Again, data cache does happen on the server. We're going to store data across user requests and also deployment. We can revalidate data, but by default, it's going to be persisted. So in data caching, we are going to persist the data as much as possible. In fact, Next.js caches by default. So by default, force cache is going to be true over here. So you can see you can use the browser fetch API, and Next.js extends the fetch function, and you can add additional properties such as the cache and next property, which we'll take a look at in a second. But force cache is the default. Now, if we take a look at another diagram for data fetching, using the fetch function, you can perform 3 different types of requests. One is static site generation, then other one is incremental static regeneration, and the third one is server-side rendering. So in the first one with static site generation, what essentially happens is since Next.js extends the browser fetch API, and this is a special fetch function, this force cache is available by default. This means whenever you use the fetch function, it's going to be cached by default. If you don't want it to cache, then we have 2 different options. One is you can just use incremental static regeneration, which means that for a specific time period, you're going to choose that, hey, I only want this data to be cached for an hour. So you can add 3600 seconds here. But let's say you don't want to do that, then you can also add 0 as well. But let's say you don't want to do that, then you can use cache no store, which is also server-side rendering, which means that it will not cache and it will fetch data every single time. In this specific one, it is going to cache every single hour. So it will cache the data for an hour, but on the hour mark, it's going to refetch the data. But that first user is going to get stale data. But the second user onwards, it's going to get fresh data. So on until the second hour mark goes on. So that's how incremental static regeneration works. And the caching happens on the data cache layer. The data cache layer is in fact stored on the server, and it's going to be persistent across requests. So it doesn't matter how many requests you make, it's going to be persistent. So you really need to make sure you know how to invalidate the cache. Now, there are several ways of invalidating the cache, but Let's take a look at an example for how fetch works and then come back to invalidating it a bit later. Now, whenever you're ready to level up your Next.js skills, I have some good news. I'm running a exclusive hands-on workshop for you to take your Next.js knowledge to the next level. It will teach you everything that you need to know to design, build, and deploy a full stack app with Next.js. It is a live workshop, so you will get direct access to me and I will answer any questions that you may have as well. Plus, at the same time, you will get lots of exercises to learn different topics in Next.js. You will be divided into breakout rooms so you can learn from your workshop peers as well and learn complex topics together. And if you get stuck, don't worry because I'm there to help guide you as well. Additionally, you can show off your certificate of completion at your workplace or on LinkedIn to showcase that you are a certified Next.js developer. At the same time, I will be sharing a lot that I couldn't necessarily share in this specific crash course in that workshop. So if you're interested, please sign up to the waitlist, as the waitlist folks get exclusive launch discounts and special bonuses as well. So sign up to the waitlist and I will see you in the workshop. So let's dive into data cache and look at each one by one. The first one is static site generation. By default, cache force cache is default. So that means we are going to cache by default. Next.js caches by default. So if you take a look at our application, this is the Next.js app router. At the bottom, we have our terminal, which is running our application. We have the code, and we will take a look at that in a second. But on the right-hand side, we have a simple app called as Caching Explained, which displays a list of items from an API, and we will take a look at the API too. And then there's another page called Go to Product Counter, which literally shows the list of items on the page. So the way we are pulling data to show on the page is using something called as a mock API. Now you can also create a mock API as well. It's completely free for one API endpoint. Right now we have 3 different products that are generated, but I could just go ahead and click on 7, and this means when I refresh the page, now there are 7 products created, which is pretty awesome. So we can modify and edit whatever products we want, and this is pretty awesome because this way we will be able to test out our caching and seeing if data is cached or not, and so on. On top, we have this specific page which has a function called as get data. Now this get data is using fetch to basically invoke the mock API request that we just saw. And it's returning the response and we are displaying it onto the page here. Then on top, we have a link, which is this product counter link. And at the bottom, we are basically mapping through the list of products and displaying price, name, and description. Now, by default, inside of fetch, because we don't specify anything, it's in fact, like I mentioned, cache is force cache, which is this specific option. Now, even if we don't mention it, it's going to be there by default. This means now we have changed the products to 7. So if I refresh the page, it's still going to be cached and it's still showing 3 products, even though in reality there are 7 products. And that's because fetch function caches by default, it uses static site generation. Let's say we were to look into incremental static regeneration. In that case, what we could do is we could just say next, revalidate, and here we can add whatever number of seconds we want for our data to get purged, data to get revalidated. So here I can just say 2. This means after 2 seconds, you're going to get fresh data. The first request after 2 seconds is going to be stale data, but the following request is going to be fresh data. Let's take a look. I'm going to refresh the page. And you can see that I got fresh data from the API. Over here in the logs, you can see that first cache was hit and then we got the request that we need. So now if I refresh the page, this is in fact showing hit. That means we are getting cache data. Now, if you want to get the same level of logging here, then you can also go to next config and add this specific property, which logging fetches full URL as true. This will show us when the cache data is hit, miss, or skip. This means we can see if our API request is being cached or not, which really helps us as we build our Next.js application. The third one is in fact server-side rendering, which is cache no store. That means I don't want caching at all. I want to refetch every single time. In that case, I'm going to say cache no store. Now this means I'm going to get fresh data every single time. So this is fine. But now if we go to our mock API and change this to, let's say, 4 again, if I refresh the page, I get new data. Again, if I make this 11, if I refresh the page, then I get 11 products, which is exactly what we want. So this is how data cache essentially works inside of Next.js. We can use the fetch function to essentially revalidate our data and purge our cache whenever we want, but this is on a page level. Now let's talk about tagging a cache. Now let's say I want to go ahead and tag my cache. I don't want to opt into page level caching like we just saw, but I want to invalidate it, especially only when I get new data. So in that case, I could go ahead and use the fetch function to tag my cache by using next tags, and then I can go ahead and invalidate the data. Now, the way I could invalidate the data or purge my cache is using a few different ways. One is I could use revalidate path, which is a function inside of Next.js. Validate tag, again, I can use revalidate tag here because I have tagged this specific fetch request, and now I can revalidate tag, which is purge that specific tag. And I can also use router.refresh function as well. Revalidate path and revalidate tag can be called in a route handler as well as server actions. So we will take a look at that in a second. Now, in order for us to tag the cache and then revalidate it, let's just take a look at another example. As we look at this specific code, I have updated a few things. We have the same fetch call that we had earlier, but now we have a new form on the page. Again, the link stays as is, but at the bottom, we have this new form. And this specific new form is a special form as it uses a server action. Now, we are using the button to then call a form action, and we are calling this revalidate action. And you can see this button, purge cache for products. This is that button that's going to execute the action. So if I click on revalidate action, let's take a look at this. The fact that it has a use server directive means that this is a server action, and we are calling it on a form. So ideally, we would like to perform some sort of a mutation here. Maybe you can imagine that we are updating some data, we are deleting some data, and so on. But for the sake of this example, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to use revalidate tag and revalidate path like we saw earlier. So let me just get rid of this for now. So what we're going to do is inside of fetch, we are going to, I want next to tag a few things. So I want this specific request to be tagged as Ankita. Now, the minute I do that, and I'm going to say over here that the user, whenever the user clicks on this button, then I want the data to get revalidated. That means I just want that data to get purged. So now I'm going to refresh the page. I have basically used Command Shift R, which basically cleared my cache because it's a hard refresh. This means that my cache was skipped and it did a hard refresh. So now I have fresh data. And the minute I did that, let's go to our mock API and change this to 4 products. Now, if I refresh the page, obviously nothing should happen, but the cache was hit. So that means we did get the cache data. And now if I click on purge cache for products, you can see that the data has changed from 11 to 4 because I'm saying that, hey, please revalidate the tagged cache item Ankita, and this means just get the new data. So now if I go ahead and go to product counter, I see 4, which is what we want because now we have revalidated that specific tag completely. So this is how you can tag a specific fetch function and then purge the cache as needed as you expect fresh data to be there. But if you don't do this, then you're still going to see stale data. So for example, if I don't do this at all, and so I'm going to say, give me 0 items. Now, if I refresh the page, nothing really happens because obviously our fetch function is tagged. We're not purging the cache yet. Now, it doesn't matter if I click this button or not, it's never going to give me the latest data. But again, if I get back the specific function again and click on purge cache, then you can see that all the data is gone. And now you can see fetch cache default no store is the reason for the cache skipping. because there are no products here, and that's exactly what we see. Let's go back and get some data as well. So let's just get 8 products this time. Let me do that. We have our revalidate tag again there. So if I click on purge cache, you will see 8 products here. And if I click on go to product counter, it still shows 0. Now, if I refresh the page, I should see fresh data. But because the link component itself uses another cache, which is called as a router cache, so it's going to cache between routes as well. And for that reason, we need to also make sure we use revalidate path so that we are able to purge the cache. So here we can say revalidate path product counter, and now if we go to product counter, we should see 8 because we have gone ahead and revalidated the data there because of the router cache that we will talk about in a second. You could do the same thing inside of route handlers as well inside of Next.js, but that's what data cache does. Because it's stored on the server, we are persisting the data across requests, and you can opt out of it using no store option that we saw earlier. But if you don't want to do that and we want to cache as much as possible, then we need to know how we can invalidate the data as well. The third cache is the router cache. Again, it is the React server components payload. It does happen on the client, which is the browser, and it will reduce server requests or navigation. That's the purpose of this router cache, and it is user session based or time based. What router cache does is that this happens on the client itself, and what it's going to do is it's going to cache the React server component payload, and it's going to split it by different routes because React server components can be used anywhere in our application. In fact, by default, every single page is a React server component. That's what router cache will do. The way you would indirectly use router cache, even though you don't realize it, is when you use the link component. Now, this is when you are going to touch the router cache. Now, to navigate between different pages from one page to the other is when you would use router cache. Next.js would do is that it would store it in the browser memory or use in-memory cache, and it is going to store the static routes as well as the dynamic routes. Now, you can invalidate the router cache by using cookies.set or cookies.delete, or you could also use the same mechanism that we saw earlier for data cache. You can truly invalidate it by using revalidate path, revalidate tag. Why does router cache exist when we already have data cache? Well, router cache exists so that they can improve the navigation experience between pages. So they know what are the previously visited routes. If the framework can cache as much as possible, that means the user is going to get really fast page load. Their first experience with your site is going to be really good, and their overall site experience is also going to be really good. So that's what router cache does. It's going to prefetch the future routes if you use the link component from Next.js. But unfortunately, you cannot necessarily opt out of router cache. You cannot opt out, but you can definitely invalidate the cache by using prefetch equals false on the link component. Or also, you can invalidate it by using revalidate path, revalidate tag, router.refresh, and so on, as well as cookies.set or cookies.delete. And that's exactly how router cache works as well. Now, if we go back to the same example, now here we revalidated the path with the product counter. But let's say we don't want caching on product counter at all. So what we could do is, by default, prefetch is in fact true. So I'm going to say prefetch is going to be false. So now let's just change from 8 products to less number of products. So we can say 5. Now I refresh the page. Again, data is cache. If I purge the cache for products, we have 5 products now. Now, because with the link component, I'm saying that, hey, for the router cache, I don't want you to cache the data. I want the prefetch to be false. That means the prefetch is not going to prefetch the page in the background. So if I go to product counter, I now see 5, and it's no longer storing the old information anymore, because right now the products are in fact 5. Now the next one is full route cache. Now with full route cache, this is going to cache HTML document as well as the React server component payload, but this time it does happen on the server, and its purpose is to reduce the rendering cost and improve performance. And it can be persistent. That means the duration is persistent and can be revalidated. So what full route cache is going to do is it's going to skip sending new requests if there is a payload in the router cache. So if the payload exists, then full route cache is not going to necessarily refetch it. Again, because it's stored on the server, it's only going to store static routes and it's going to be persistent across routes. It's not going to necessarily cache dynamic routes. Similarly, for router cache, because it happens in the browser, it's in memory, it's going to store static as well as dynamic routes. Again, when we can revalidate data cache by redeploying, or we can completely invalidate it by purging the cache using revalidate path, revalidate tag that we saw earlier as well. At the same time, we could use properties like revalidate equals 0, dynamic equals force dynamic, and with fetch, if any of the fetch functions, which is any of the data cache function, let's say it has the no store option, then in that case, we can definitely opt out of the full route cache as well. Let's take a look at the revalidate equals 0 option. Now, if you want to use the incremental static regeneration option that we saw earlier here as well, now there's one more way. If you want to make sure you can basically revalidate the path completely, the page completely, then you could do that by using this specific property, which is revalidate equals 3600 seconds. This means that it's going to revalidate all the fetch requests in a route segment itself. Now, if we go back to our example, and if I expose this here, I'm going to get rid of this tag completely. This means that every hour, anything on this page, the data fetching policy is going to be cached for an hour, and then after that the cache is going to get purged. But if I change this to 0, this means that every single time there's new data, then we get new data as well. So for example, if I go back to the mock API and change this to 4 instead of 30, if I refresh the page, I get 4. If I go to product counter, again, I need to make sure that we revalidate path here. If I purge the cache, if I go to product counter, is in fact 4 as well. But with revalidate equals 0 options means that it's going to basically refetch the data every single time. And for product counter, it was not the same because it's not in the same route segment. So this is a separate route, this is a separate route. So this is why we had to purge the cache manually and enable revalidate path product counter, when in fact we did not necessarily need to do that for this specific page. Now we have 4 products with revalidate 0, and let's not trigger the button, let's not click the button purge cache. Now let's just change this to 14 products. The minute we do that, if I refresh the page, I'm not purging the cache at all. That means there's no caching. Then in that case, if I refresh the page, you can see that the cache is skipped, and because it's auto cached, and then you can see that I have received all the products that I need. But if I go to product counter, it's still 4 products, and that's because the data fetching policy for this specific page is now to fetch every single time, but that does not mean that it's also the same for the product counter page. Here we are literally displaying the length of the items, and we are not specifying the product policy at all to be 4. And if you want to do the same, then what we need to do is just copy this code and paste it here. And now you can see that the products are in fact 14. Data fetching policy per route segment is the same. But because these 2 route segments were completely separate and completely different, this specific value, this specific line only applied to this specific page. So if you want to do that, you can do the same as well. So this is how full route cache works inside of Next.js 2. So now we have seen request memoization, data cache, full route cache, and router cache. Now these are all the different ways Next.js caches data. So I really hope this gave you a good understanding for it. So now going back to our diagram that we discussed earlier, this is the caching behavior. It might make sense for you to see what miss, set, hit means in the caching world. So the first time the router cache, the in-memory cache, is going to store the RSC payload, which is the React Server Component payload. Then this is going to happen on the client side. But on the build time, the full route cache is going to store the React Server Components payload along with the HTML document. Then in-memory cache for request memoization is going to get triggered if there is a fetch function involved at all, or if we are basically using the cache function to cache it. But at the same time, if there is persistent data cache, then it's going to set it. And then finally, it's going to get data from the data source. Entirely, this depends if the route is statically or dynamically rendered, data is cached or uncached, or whether a request is part of an initial request, initial visit, or a subsequent navigation. Depending on your specific use case, you can configure caching differently, but knowing all these different caching mechanisms inside of Next.js will really make you a strong Next. What are some burning questions about Next.js caching? Or if you have any questions about Next.js in general, please comment below and let me know. I really hope you enjoyed this specific video. As next steps, if you are interested in learning Next.js further, either you can sign up for my workshop at nextjsworkshop.dev, check the link in the description below, or I have a completely free crash course for you on my channel on Next.js that you can check out as well. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.